everyone. I'm going to go ahead and call the GNR committee to order. Good to see you all. We have two items on our agenda. First, the omnibus text change, and then the green growth toolkit. So I think we'll hear about the omnibus text change first. There will be an opportunity for public comment for everyone that's here after each topic, and we'll just see who would like to speak on anything that we are discussing today. Thanks.
So I see Justin Rometta has come to the podium. So as you'll remember, this is a continued item. There were a number of items that the council informally gave direction on that will come back when you report this out. But there were a number of items on the omnibus that you wanted a deeper dive in terms of additional explanation. So Justin Rometta, our zoning administrator, is here to walk you through that.
Good afternoon. Thank you. Filling in for my colleague Keegan McDonald today, who led you through this discussion at your last meeting. So hopefully I can help you all get this item to the finish line. I know at your last meeting, Pat and Keegan did a pretty thorough overview and history of the purpose of the Omnibus program, but for the benefit of anyone in the audience or online who didn't see the last meeting, I can just briefly recap. The Omnibus program was implemented a few years ago. It's a way for staff to bring forward suggestions and improvements to the UDO, namely by addressing items that might arise in its day-to-day administration for a variety of reasons that might need clarification. Ultimately, obviously, the council has full authority to accept or reject any of these changes. Any change that would result would come in the form of an ordinance that would culminate in a public hearing at the full city council meeting. We try to choose items on the omnibus list that are in one or more of these categories. Low effort, meaning that there's a kind of a readily apparent solution available that doesn't involve a lot of research or outreach. Low impact in terms of policy change, and then high priority, just meaning that the change would address an issue that either has caused confusion or is in reaction to some state law change, or just generally contributes to some pain point that's felt either by staff or other users of the code. So the entire list is 32 items long. At your last meeting, you asked us to come back on a handful of those items. 2 of those we're recommending, we pulled from the list. We're removing at the recommendation of the city attorney's office. That was item 15, related to the district intent statements, and item 32, which was the proposed removal of the building type table. As far as the other 4, I can go through each of those in some detail now. The first was related to transparency. Apologies for the typo in the heading there. This is item 5, transparency. As a reminder, the intent here is just to clarify that only windows and doors that are actually transparent would satisfy the transparency requirement. You had some feedback last time requesting that we address new or repurposed garage doors in existing buildings that were only kind of for pedestrian use only, and as well as some exemption for doors that are integrated into an EMS or fire station or some similar facility. So we actually drafted some language here that we think should address those comments. You can see here just proposing to strike the words windows and doors and replace it with transparency. And then here at the bottom of the screen, number 5 is just an explicit exemption for doors that are a part of a police, fire, or EMS station. I would note for this item that one, existing buildings aren't required to necessarily comply with transparency anyway. They just can't make, the building just couldn't be any less transparent than before, if that makes sense. And then 2, fire stations in those facilities are generally located in what's called a civic building type, which doesn't carry a transparency requirement anyway. But in the event that it were in, say, a mixed-use building or something of that sort, we think this language in number 5 should address those comments. Do you want me stop after each item? Do you want to?
I would suggest just keep going. Thanks.
So item 6 was related to parking and the maximum number of stories. The intent here, again, was to clarify that parking levels that are above ground should continue to count towards a building's maximum height limit, but levels that are underground should not. And the committee requested last time that we come back using the Z4322 Clover Lane case as kind of a case study in how this would apply to that case. So we drafted some language here as well. I'm going to skip over these first two. You do have all of this in your backup, but this is really just kind of a restructuring of some language. There's nothing new proposed in these first two slides. But the real kind of meat of it is here, where essentially some clarification that a parking level, in order to count as a story, has to meet two tests. One is that it has both a ceiling and a floor, and the other is that it's not considered a basement. So here's an example, some sample elevations for a scenario where a parking level would count as a story towards a building's maximum height limit. And it would today and would continue to do so if you adopted this change. But you can see while at the front of the building, that lower level is 100% underground. On the rear, it is entirely exposed, and on the two sides, it's exposed more than 50%. So this is a scenario that under today's code, that level would count as a story and would continue to do so if you adopted the proposed change. You contrast that with what you see here, where all four levels of this building are entirely below grade. So this is the scenario in which staff was trying to address with this text change. A strict read of the existing code language would say that this scenario here is actually a story that counts towards a building's maximum story height, even though no portion of that level is above the ground. So what that means for Clover Lane ultimately is going to depend on the plans that get submitted. But what they showed during the rezoning was a 4-story building on top of basement parking, and that this is a site that slopes from significantly from left to right on the screen, from Wake Forest Road down to Watauga Street. So in looking at this diagram here, if the building on the right side of the slide is the Clover Lane building, if that level of parking at the bottom there qualifies as a basement, then those 4 stories of building could be built on top per the zoning. If that parking level fails that basement test, meaning it doesn't meet the two pieces of being a basement, then that building would be too tall, because that would be considered a 5-story building. So the key takeaway really is what the proposal doesn't change the test of what is a basement, therefore doesn't really materially change the outcome of this case. It's just kind of clarifying you're either a basement or you're a story, and if you're a basement, you don't count towards a story. The third item was related to attics and half-story. Big picture here was just to add definitions for terminology that we don't have existing today, to kind of clarify regulations in certain NCODs and on certain older rezoning cases that might have conditions that prescribe a maximum height limit in stories. So he asked us to do some research, some historical records, and provide some language and examples for this item. Unfortunately, our research was not really fruitful in determining really a common definition or understanding specific to Raleigh or specific to any neighborhood in Raleigh when those regulations were adopted. So we really just looked at other definitions elsewhere. We looked at the building code and kind of how our UDO defines other spaces in a building. And we included 2 draft definitions, one for story and half story, that will be added to the code. The half-story definition on the bottom is really just a version of how we define an attic today. So we basically took our attic definition today, which prohibits it, any habitable space, and allowed some of that space to be habitable while limiting the size and height of what a half-story could be. So as long as more than half of the floor area is less than 7.5 feet tall, someone could finish that space or construct a space like that as habitable, and it would count as a half-story, not a full story. Here's just the kind of clarification then to the attic definition, noting that space then in no case could be uninhabitable, or in no case could be habitable, excuse me. More proposed language. This is the same definition, just inserting it in a different place in the code for ease of reference. Here's kind of an example, hypothetical. If the space on the left you see today would be an attic, in theory, could then be finished and converted to what you see on the right. And in theory, if that space were, met those thresholds of the 50% of the floor area and the less than 7.5 feet floor height, that would be a half story. The final item was 31, related to crawl spaces. So this was, I think you asked for some feedback or some examples or definitions here as well. Again, this is really just the purpose is to add a definition, of which there is none today, that might pertain to certain zoning cases that might have a condition relating to the requirement for a crawl space. So we looked at the building code here as well, found that neither the NC building code or the residential code define crawl space, but it's typically kind of understood as that unfinished space between the ground and the first floor. North Carolina residential code does define crawl space wall as the opaque portion of a wall that encloses a crawl space and is partially or totally below grade. So with that in mind, we developed the definition you see here. We worked with our colleagues in building and safety. Key takeaway from the definition is that a crawl space would have to be unfinished and uninhabitable and would need to be exposed at least 1.5 feet above grade. So I think that addresses your comments, and that is the end of the items you asked for feedback on. I'm happy to take any questions on those or any of the other items.
Yeah, any questions from committee members? Council Member Patton?
Yeah, thanks for that. One question on the crawl spaces. Does it have to be accessible? I mean, the photo you showed was, and that's usually the intention, but is that in the definition, and should it be?
It wouldn't hurt. Yeah, we could add that it has to be accessible. Sure, I think. Yeah.
Okay. I'm asking because this one in particular is a response to a constituent concern of mine, and they just built up a very tall platform essentially, and I think that's part of it. Is
Questions as to whether
you can't actually get under it. So I think that's part of what has driven the conversation for the residents. So.
Yeah, I think some of the definitions we looked at had language that spoke to for the purpose of accessing equipment or utilities or something like that. So we could certainly look to add some language to that effect.
Cool, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Council Member Branch? Any other questions from committee members?
Well, just with that added change, I guess my question is, could we approve it with that said change, and then it'll be in place when it comes to the full council?
Yeah.
Yes, I think ultimately what you're recommending is that the city council authorize work on this text change, and you could state with the modifications recommended by the committee.
If that's fine, I will move for approval with said modification on crawl space as is.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. And I was going to check, is there anyone in the public who would like to speak about any of these text changes? Just raise your hand.
I think everyone is staff.
Okay, just checking. Okay, could be someone hiding out there. So at this point, I guess I'll go forward to make a motion to approve all of these items for moving back to our regular council meeting for approval
With said changes.
with said changes.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All right, that's 4-0. And
Just to confirm, that included removal of section 15 and 32. Okay, thank you.
thanks. All right, so I do believe next we have the Green Growth Toolbox presentation.
Great. Good afternoon. Pat Young with Planning and Development. I'm going to kick this item off to some colleagues. First, we're going to have Brooke Massa with the NC Wildlife Resources Commission. The NC Wildlife Resource Commission is the author of the Green Growth Toolbox, which is a statewide tool that was developed by the state for local governments to assess both their programs and ordinances to make sure that they were using best practices to keep our communities green and healthy. And it's a great tool. I used it when I was in Durham. And what we're going to, after Brooke provides an overview of the toolbox, we're going to have Bonham Walter and a number of teammates that she'll introduce go through some of the work that we're already doing that aligns with the Green Growth Toolbox, and then talk about where we have some areas where we could use some of the suggestions that suggest the Green Growth Toolbox tools to improve our practices. So with that, I'll turn it over to Brooke.
All right, good afternoon. Thanks again. My name is Brooke Massa. I'm a conservation biologist with the Wildlife Resources Commission. I feel like this is, can I just put it back? Is that okay? Y'all hear me? Okay. So in case you're not familiar with the Wildlife Resources Commission, we're a state agency who's tasked with regulating and providing hunting and fishing opportunities, but we also have many conservation programs to do wildlife and natural resource conservation in the state. And one program, it's a very small program in our agency, is the Green Growth Toolbox. And that's what we're here for today. Let me, do I just, oh, wait, sorry. Okay. Oh, great. There, great. Okay, I didn't see the keyboard down there hiding. Okay. So the Green Growth Toolbox is a non-regulatory technical assistance program that's targeting local governments and supporting them in doing conservation-based land use and transportation planning. It was developed in collaboration with many partners, including regional councils of governments, some local governments, as well as nonprofit conservation organizations like the Nature Conservancy, other state agencies, like the Natural Heritage Program is a key partner in developing the tools for the Green Growth Toolbox, and federal agencies as well, like the Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Forest Service. But the most important partner that we work with are the local governments that take these tools and implement them in their communities. So the reason why the Wildlife Resources Commission became interested in land use planning is because every 10 years we go through a planning process and create a strategic action plan. And in that process, we identify the species of greatest conservation need in our state. And for each of those species, we go through the threats that those species face. And time again, the pattern of development, and development in general, but more the pattern of development is what, like the top threat for most of the species that are of conservation need in our state. And those species of conservation need include species that are listed as threatened and endangered species, but also includes many species whose populations are in decline, but may not have been in decline enough to warrant listing, but if conservation action isn't taken, eventually they may become threatened or endangered species in our state. So this is the story of why. Obviously, there's a lot of habitat loss in the state. If you were to look at this map and see it in 1980, the map would be mostly green. But with projected housing density, and really the 2020 housing density looks pretty similar. There's a lot of suburban growth in North Carolina, and that's obviously direct habitat loss. And you probably saw this headline come out a couple of weeks ago, I think it was, where Wake County did a tree canopy assessment and determined that they lost over 11,000 acres of trees the past decade. And this is an interesting comparison to comparing it to the Walmart size, but it's really telling that we're losing a lot of natural resources in the state, and that's habitat loss. So that's obvious a cause for population declines. But it's not just habitat loss, really. It's the complementary impacts that go along with habitat loss, such as habitat fragmentation and habitat degradation. So if you look at this slide, it shows the schematic. Like on the left there is undeveloped land. As you put more houses in it, the habitat gets more broken up into smaller and smaller patches as we move to a more urban landscape. As these patches become disconnected to one another and degraded by the adjacent land uses around these habitats, then they become less valuable for wildlife and other natural resources. And certainly wildlife and plants will have a hard time dispersing through a landscape that's more like the urban landscape or the suburban landscape, where habitat is broken up into smaller pieces that are disconnected from one another. So it's really those three things working in concert: habitat loss, habitat fragmentation, and habitat degradation that's leading to these wildlife population declines. So green growth is a planning paradigm where it's recommending that communities consider all their natural resources in planning and influence development towards areas that are more suitable for development and driving development away from areas that are more suitable for conservation. So it's working together to promote inward development, kind of what Raleigh is really aiming to do with its comprehensive planning, right? It's inward development, infill development, high density development. And by doing that, you're doing a better job at protecting areas that are more valuable for natural resources, like on the outskirts of the city where there's less development. And so the Green Growth Toolbox is a set of resources that's aiming to build a communication bridge between natural resource professionals who work out in the field, understand where high quality natural areas occur, where species occur, where other natural resources occur that need protection, and those of you who are working to make decisions about how land use, land use is being decided at a community level. So it's like a communication bridge that goes both ways, hopefully. The reason why the Wildlife Commission would be interested in working with a town like the city of Raleigh is because urban spaces are critical for ecosystem resilience at a statewide level. We are an urbanizing state. We have lots of urban areas where habitat is being fragmented severely, and so you can really look at urban spaces and identify opportunities to connect habitat across urban lands, provide habitat hubs in parks and other spaces by doing restoration work or by conserving points along a habitat network that would act as a pathway for wildlife and plants to disperse across the landscape. There's other ways that communities can support biodiversity, like through native plant landscaping and landscaping lists, looking at your landscaping list and taking out all the invasives, obviously, but also exotic plants and replacing them with good native plants, and doing low impact development and other things to reduce stormwater impacts on our aquatic environments and our water quality. But one of the things that we also like to emphasize, especially with elected officials and advisory board members, is that by doing so, you're going to be supporting other community goals besides biodiversity conservation, such as many communities now, and I think Raleigh does too, has climate resiliency goals. And so you can really look at your natural areas as an opportunity to, store and sequester carbon, right, and help meet your greenhouse gas emission targets. Also provide hazard mitigation. So if you're protecting your floodplain, you're going to do a better job at keeping property and lives safe during these extreme weather events that are more common, right, with climate change and et cetera. So there's a ton of research on the value of these natural areas, not only for the biodiversity, but our communities. One of the examples that we really like to talk about with communities that still have more rural lands, maybe like at the Wake County level, is that by planting native plants in your landscaping rather than invasive exotic species, you'll be supporting pollinators, right? And that's another buzzword of the time. You really want to support our pollinator species because they support our agricultural economy. The honeybees do a lot of work, right? 1/3 of crop pollination, but our native pollinator species are doing most of the work to pollinate our crops. So we have a lot of documented information on what are the co-benefits that communities can gain when they protect their natural areas. So you'll find all that information in chapter 1 of our handbook, which we have a set of resources. So what's in the Green Growth Toolbox is a handbook, which is really tailored towards land use planners, but hopefully it's accessible that anybody could read it and pick it up and understand how to use the tools of land use planning to get better conservation outcomes for your community. We also have recommended set of conservation data that we share and interpret for land use planners and others interested parties and how to use that in land use planning. We have a website, obviously, where you can get all that information. We do training workshops tailored to a community, so we can come in for a half day or full day and do training workshops. And really, usually it's land use planners, but local advisory board members, sometimes elected officials will come to our workshops and learn about all the different data layers and how they can be used in land use planning. We do technical assistance, so like you're doing a UDO update or whatever you want to call omnibus, whatever you're calling it. One of the services that we would provide is being able to look through your UDO and look for opportunities to get better conservation outcomes through ordinance language or through a plan or through a small area plan or other types of land use tools that are being, projects that are being done by a community. And lastly, we just have a small pot of funding to support communities doing conservation-based land use planning. It's called Partners for Green Growth. And in sort of thinking about looking at this presentation, I went through your comprehensive plan, which I've gone to many times. It's a good example of great policies for conservation-based land use planning. And I identified just a handful of policies that just, are like dovetail with the goals of the Green Growth Toolbox. And I don't know where you are in implementation of any of these strategies, but if there are, projects coming up where you're trying to think about how to implement these strategies or improve the implementation of these strategies, then this would be the type of thing that we could provide technical assistance on. So I'd be glad to work with you all. So with that, I just thank you for your time. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around if you want me to.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for being with us. Any questions from the committee?
I just have a question from staff, just based on the toolbox and how it's used. Are there any examples of ways we can implement it?
I think they're going to give a presentation next.
Oh,
Staff
okay.
will.
I didn't see it in the background. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Well, yeah, and there is, in the handbook, it's full of examples. That's what the handbook is like recommendations on how you use conservation data in land use planning, and then case studies that link to communities that are doing that, either in North Carolina or in other states. But we try to link mostly to North Carolina communities who are doing the work. So there's going to be a good set of examples to look to in the handbook. Yeah.
Council Member Patton?
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Glad
Sure.
you're here. Can you talk about the National Heritage Registry? What is it? How would it be used? When does it get updated?
Okay, so the Natural Heritage Program has this tool. It's the Data Explorer, where all biologists and even interested citizen scientists can share their data with the Natural Heritage Program, which is a program in the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources at the state. And they compile all the data and they share it through this data sharing platform that's available to the public. And it's updated quarterly. And so as far as natural, so that's like a big data resource that we promote with the Green Growth Toolbox to be used in land use planning. But then within that data, there is these data that are, there is a data set called the Natural Heritage Natural Areas. Is that what you're asking more specifically about? Maybe?
I'm not sure.
Okay, so natural heritage, natural areas, if you're thinking about that, are areas in the state that have been identified as having either multiple rare species that are occurring within those areas, or there's high quality functioning ecosystems that are of the highest quality in the state. And so if you aim protection to be if you aim to protect your natural heritage natural areas, then you would be like working to protect the areas of the highest biodiversity value in the state. And around Raleigh, there are quite a few, especially in the streams, in the Neuse and everything, because there are rare species still existing in some of those streams. Yeah.
Councilmember Pat Young, if you don't mind, I'm going to follow up on that. The tool that Brooke just described is really valuable and really powerful, which shows where threatened species either live or transit. It's not at a scale and level of specificity to be used for direct land use regulation, right? You can't say this parcel does and this parcel doesn't. It shows an area. The way we've used it in places I've worked in the past is to say that if the map suggests that you're in that area, that there be additional assessment, that the applicant provide additional assessment, and there's a site-specific determination. So I just wanted to make clear that this isn't something that would be able to be used as a zoning overlay.
Okay, so it's not like a layer in IMAPs that I can turn on and.
Well, you can, but we can't use it to regulate individual pieces of land. Does that make sense? Yeah.
The two biggest ones in Raleigh are the Neuse River, and the part of it that's in our jurisdiction, and Umstead Park. So we already know about them.
Got
We're
it.
already doing a lot of things to protect those two particular areas.
Thank you all.
All right, perhaps our next presentation, and then we can see if there's more questions.
Do you all want me to stick around, or should I?
Yeah, please, if you don't mind.
okay, sure.
Thank you.
So we will make sure that the additional presentation gets put into board docs. If it's, I see council members perceiving it's not in, that it's not in there.
Sounds great. Hi, Bynum Walter, Planning and Development. Great to see you all this afternoon. I want to talk about green growth. I don't know where my presentation is. Green growth toolbox in Raleigh. Luke's going to help me out. While he's doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and say a few things. So you heard from Wildlife Commission from Brooke about the intent and philosophy of the Green Growth Toolbox. I'm going to talk this afternoon about what implementation in Raleigh looks like. And I just want to say a couple things. One, I'm hitting the mountaintops today. There's not a lot of detail here. This is just like a flavor sampler to pique your interest. And I did not put this content together by myself. Lots of folks helped with this. And so I want to just acknowledge Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources, the Office of Sustainability, Raleigh Water, our stormwater colleagues in Engineering Services. Just lots of folks pitched in on this. They're representatives of all those programs here in the room today, if you want to get off the mountaintop and go a little deeper. But just wanted to kind of give you a sampler to start the conversation. And some of the highlights that I'm gonna, what's going on?
He'll have it up shortly.
Okay. Great, thanks. Thank you. Some of the highlights I want to hit today include our Community Climate Action Plan, our Watershed Protection Program, the work we do around stormwater management and regulation, the land stewardship coming out of our parks, and the land planning coming out of our Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources Department, as well as the development regulations that we have in place through the Unified Development Ordinance. And then the second half of this presentation, Justin Rabetta is going to talk with you a little bit about how we could bring regulations for native species planting more forward into the UDO. So the primary, Brooke talked a little bit about this, the primary themes coming out of the Green Growth Toolbox, maintaining those land use patterns that do not fragment, wildlife habitat, that we establish land use patterns that maintain rural character, that conserve, buffer, and connect habitat. One of the ways that we do that is by making the most of existing urban and suburban areas by encouraging higher density development there, mixed use there, transit-oriented development there. Infill development that does not expand the suburbs is the best thing we can do for wildlife. And then in rural areas, we know that our development needs to be clustered, mostly with smaller lot sizes, possibly a conservation incentive district that conserves habitats. And I would note that's very much the work that we're doing on the zoning overlay for the portion of the Southeast study that you all directed us to consider bringing into for ETJ expansion, that when we did that, we would apply, the idea is that we would apply this type of zoning in that area. We have a lot of city plans, just generally, but a couple of biggies that address this issue. Community Climate Action Plan, our comprehensive plan, our strategic plan, as well as the open space plan that came out of a strategic plan initiative team. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of each of these. So the Community Climate Action Plan, sometimes we call that CCAP, is our path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% by 2050. And it addresses equity and community resilience. It prioritizes more dense, more mixed-use places to reduce our VMT, vehicle miles traveled, and also to improve car-free mobility in the city. To help us reduce greenhouse gas emissions, the plan also emphasizes electrifying transportation and supporting development of renewables, as well as building efficiency. Then I would also mention we are a member of biophilic cities, which means that we're working to connect people, nature, and the built environment. And we are also a Bee City USA. You heard Brooke talk about pollinators. That program recognizes that we're doing a good job in trying to prioritize pollinators and native species. So CCAP supports infill development as an essential means to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We can't minimize impacts elsewhere without allowing more density and more mixed use in our urbanized areas. The Office of Sustainability and Planning and Development have also recognized that there's an area for partnership for us here. We're evaluating options for a green building ordinance that would allow more people to live in mixed use areas. One of Raleigh Water's initiatives that I think is particularly relevant to Green Growth Toolbox is the Watershed Protection Program. So that focuses on our upper Neuse River Basin, and while less than 1% of the basin is in our jurisdiction, it's vitally important to our drinking water systems. Since 2005, we have been partnered to protection of more than 11,000 acres, and we've made a really big investment in this. We put a lot of dollars toward this, but that has been very successfully leveraged to bring contributions from other partners valued at 7 times our outlay. Stormwater, as part of our engineering services program, is also doing really important work here. Of course, Neuse River buffer rules apply in Raleigh. Additionally, we have water supply watershed protection overlay districts, and we pursue restoration projects that target streams and buffer areas for enhancement. We're currently studying a mitigation banking program that could help identify possible restoration projects that could help develop credits for other city programs. And then from a floodplain perspective, city regulations limit development in the future 100-year floodplain. Those floodplains are mapped by FEMA for the larger drainage areas, and then we rely on applicants to help us map the smaller areas. We continue to pursue opportunities for voluntary buyouts to restore floodplains, and there's a future opportunity for us to become cooperating technical partner with FEMA, which would mean that Raleigh would have a greater role in developing the flood maps. Green stormwater infrastructure, Brooke talked about this. This is an important part of Raleigh's programs and actions. It's another way that we can support habitat. City regulations have been modified to allow GSI to satisfy regulatory requirements, and in some cases are required. And we lead by example on this front by incorporating GSI into city-developed projects, and it's also a consideration in our planning and watershed studies. I want to shift and talk a little bit about the work coming out of Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Resources. They are also in tune with the need to conserve wildlife and habitat. Their pre-development assessment plans of future parks, sites, document and inventory natural resources, and establish interim management plans leading up to park development. And then we also have 4 nature preserve sites totaling about 700 acres in Raleigh, and each of these contains features that contribute to biodiversity in our community. In the park planning process, Parks continues to inventory and monitor for sensitive species and habitats. I'm thinking about a rezoning case recently down off Wall Store Road where we had lampreys, right? Parks brought that to the applicant and to planning and said, hey, there are lampreys here. They're like tiny and creepy, but but we need them. We need their biodiversity, right? So they're doing a great job of evaluating that and raising those issues in the development process. Finally, I'll close by talking a little bit about what's in our regulations in the UDO already that we haven't talked about yet. We have a series of a conservation-specific zoning district, as well as a pretty wide variety of environmental overlay districts that get at sort of a mix of different issues. There are also provisions in the code for natural resource protection, and we also have compact and conservation development options. Again, we're expecting those to be supplemented by an overlay that we're developing to be first applied in the southeastern part of the city, in the Southeast Special Study Area. But the idea is that that would be useful in the Northeast as well. We have a similar short-term and long-term urban service area up in that part of the city where that would be relevant. I know I had a lot at a very, very glancing blows. If there are questions for staff, I think this, about the part I've talked about, that would be great. And then Justin is still here on to talk with you about native species plantings.
Great. Yeah, I have a few questions, Bynum, and if there's any comments too from the Resources Commission side on other topics, all ears. I'm curious both on biophilic cities and Bee City USA. How are we, I guess, implementing these, or what makes us, part of these programs?
Right. I think I'm going to hand off to Office of Super stuttery, I apologize. Office of Sustainability this afternoon
Thanks.
on that one.
Hello, good to see everybody. Megan Anderson from Sustainability. So with Biophilic Cities and Bee City USA, just as this program, it's a big collaboration between tons of departments. And we joined Biophilic Cities, I believe, last year, and Bee City we've been in for several years now. And so with that, for Bee City, we actually manage that program, so I know it a little bit more, but we're a partner on Biophilic as well, and Parks leads that process. So we actually report every year back to Bee City USA, and it's actually about habitat conservation, because that's really what supports pollinators. So with that, it's not just us, it's all the other departments, and actually a lot of community members as well. So there's a lot of people in this space that are looking at habitat and pollinator species. And so there's a group that meets every so often to talk about what they're doing. It's been a good opportunity to kind of share information, best practices as well. A lot of the universities are also, after we joined, a lot of our universities in our area have joined. There's a program for them as well. And Biophilic Cities is more relatively new, but we're one of the cities around the world as a biophilic city, and that also is an opportunity to share best practices. They have meetings, groups in Tokyo, Japan, all over the place have a biophilic city designation, so we meet online every so often to talk about best practices, and we share information as well. It comes up actually quite a bit. I just had an interesting discussion about biophilic cities this last weekend. So they're also both very big, just like our climate action plan or this. There's a lot to it, and there's a lot of things that go into it. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question specifically, so please let me know if I can give you more detailed information.
I'm just curious, are there any metrics that we have to meet to be part of those programs?
Got it. So specifically, biophilic cities, no, but we come up with our own metrics. So we show, and that's part of it being a very, there's not a one-size-fits-all on the way to look at bringing nature together with people in the urban environment. And so they like to be flexible enough for cities to talk about the way they do that. So we have a lot of metrics between sustainability, stormwater, Raleigh water, parks in that program. And we're happy to give that information back to council as a refresher on what's in there. And then Bee City USA also they have a little bit more guidance on what it is. But we do turn a report in, and we can give you back that information too. We post it. It's on Bee City website and ours too, to give you more information about that. Off the top of my head, I can't name the metrics, but it definitely has to do with habitat conservation and lots of pollinator related issues, and then community engagement and education as well.
Okay. Yeah, I guess if we could get an update on both of those programs and how we are implementing or kind of are part of those, that would be helpful. And maybe it's already on our website somewhere. You can just point me to
Sure.
that.
Yeah.
And just a couple other items. The water supply watershed protection overlay. This was related to GSI, and this might be for stormwater perhaps. I was just curious if we could hear a little bit more about the required GSI in this particular type of areas. What are the types that are being implemented? What's allowed? And then, can you name or tell me generally in the city where those watershed areas are?
And I'll turn it over to Wayne and Stormwater. And just, I was going to mention really quickly to you, we, as you know, have a climate action data dashboard that we're working on. We have buildings and energy, transportation, land use. We're building it out. We're going to be working on resilience and cross-cutting as well this year, which has a lot to do with our stormwater work and resilience equity work. And so I think a lot of the data that we're talking about in the topics here are going to be reflected in our climate action plan data dashboard soon as well, which I think relates back to the topics we were just discussing with Biophilic City and Bee City as well.
And I think I see Councilmember Patton.
Yeah, before you go away.
Okay.
And I'm going to say this jokingly, but also seriously. I would like to stop getting in trouble with my HOA for letting my clover grow in the spring. And I was curious if the bees, to what extent any work with HOAs or any progress, any advocacy there?
That's a great question. There are definitely a lot of really passionate folks that talk about those topics. So when we get an update, I'll talk to the team and see if we can put together some information about who those groups are and what they're doing for you as well. Thank you. I'll pass it over to Wayne now.
No worries. Hi, Sally Hoyt from Raleigh Stormwater. So let me try to address the different topics regarding the water supply watershed overlays. So the main two are the Falls Lake overlay, so that's up north closer to Falls Lake, and the Swift Creek overlay, which has very similar rules to the Falls Lake one and is south of 40. There's a couple of other overlays in the city, some out by Umstead Park. And they're all slightly different regulations, but in general, there's, so those are tied to state rules, but the city has slightly different regulations. No. Oh, okay. The GSI is required, it's tied in with the density. So they're each slightly different, but basically you can do a certain amount of density, and then if you're going over that amount, then you have to install green stormwater infrastructure to offset the impacts of that density. And also there's nutrient requirements because there's nutrients impacting our water supplies. So there's requirements for a maximum level of phosphorus and nitrogen that can come off of those properties. And folks have to do calculations for that, and in some cases, build the GSI devices. In terms of what we consider to be GSI in the UDO, we outline that, and it's things that get the multiple benefits of helping to infiltrate things near the site, providing vegetative, the myriad of vegetative benefits. So things like rainwater harvesting, permeable pavement, bioretention, those are kind of the core toolbox. Green roofs get used less often, but we do see a fair amount of rainwater harvesting, bioretention or rain gardens, and infiltration type practices, including permeable pavement. I don't remember what the other parts of your question were.
I think you mostly got at it. I just was trying to understand what were the specific, GSI devices that you could use. I mean, so I'm thinking we're going beyond like a stormwater pond. So it sounds like what you were mentioning was all beyond that. So thank you. And I think Councilmember Black has a follow-up on that.
Yeah, does any of that apply like retroactively or even proactively to some of the places in Raleigh that have experienced legacy flooding, like the Southeast Raleigh wetlands, Walnut Creek wetlands area that we consistently have seen like that issue as far as like GSI?
So right now, the requirement for doing GSI is in those watershed overlays, so not necessarily in the Walnut Creek watershed. We do see in some cases there being rezoning requirements proposed that address GSI, and that's come up specifically in the Walnut Creek watershed.
Is there any way that we can like look at having that like more formalized, or like what could that look like?
So maybe we come back to that at the end of the presentation. I think there is going to be some forward-looking questions about priorities in terms of future land use. Certainly, I think the City Council has been aware that I think there are some fairly tight state authorizations around watershed protection. I think the council has had some discussions previously about local authority that we have around resource management zones. But I do think at the culmination of this presentation, there are a couple of future-looking questions that could help prioritize areas of future work. So that might be something that you hold for the end
There's
of this
more
presentation.
to presentation after this?
There is.
I just wanted to talk about the GSI with that one, like if that's included in the process of like what the future could look like around GSI, specifically in areas that aren't inside of these conservation zones.
Wayne reminded me to mention our Raleigh Rainwater Rewards program, which does provide reimbursement, so financial incentive to install green stormwater infrastructure in existing development, so residential and commercial.
Awesome.
And one thing I want to mention too is I think a lot of the issues along the wetlands is, first of all, let's think about the purpose of wetlands. They're designed to filtrate water. If you really look at it historically, y'all are the experts, but correct me if I'm wrong, but they're designed to filtrate that water, so they're slowing a lot of that water down just the way it is by nature. And the major issue I found over there on South Sinus Street and every where else is that there's a lot of water coming from the north. We're having issues with water from other municipalities that comes through. And then also we just approved our last council meeting, some stormwater, I'm gonna say engagement dealing with Bentmore Hills and dealing with another stream that comes in under Rochester Heights that comes straight into Walnut Creek. So that's something else we're trying to mitigate is water coming from a lot of different areas and how fast it comes in to those areas.
I just want to throw my hat in for permeable sidewalks and streets.
So there's a lot of things that I think we've started. And I'm talking in particular the Wetland Center since it was brought up, but there's even a part where the wetland continues going near Rose Lane. And there's work that we've done over there in other areas where these attributes are bringing water that eventually gets to the Neuse. Ways that we can find some people hate saying this, developers hate saying this, they want to take water and get it out of the way. I want to kind of control it, sometimes slow it down so that water downstream from it can get out of the way, and then that water can come through, which I think leads to a lot of the ideas and things we're talking about here.
I think the concept of getting it out of the way kind of kicks the can down the road. And in the Economic Development Committee, first, funnily enough, we've kind of talked about some of these things and how it does affect equitability downstream when we start talking about like flooding.
So I think there's a part that was missing in what I was saying. I was saying controlling water that's coming. Let's control it. So that water because it's all, there's levels to this. So like I say, for instance, it can rain at my parents' house, which is north of me, and not rain at my house, and then rain at my house. So what happens to the water at my house and the other water that's coming? So ways that we can control water, then get some of it to naturally start dissipating, and then we can come through, which leads to the equity standards that hopefully the economic development will work towards.
I think that it's more for this committee, honestly, to have those kind of conversations. It seems like since we're growth and natural resources, but I just think it's interesting. I'm down. I just think it's interesting talking about some of the ways that we can either retroactively or future look at the ways that we're doing GSI through like some of the streets or sidewalks or like other things that are in place that could help manage water and slow down the flow, control the flow, manage the flow, as you were saying, Councilor Branch.
Councilmember Patton?
So I know we've had stormwater staff leave the podium, but I do want to make sure that I do highlight you do have guidance to staff in your adopted strategic plan that gives direction to staff to identify ways to advance GSI on both city and private development. So Sally, who was just at the podium, leads that and just gave an update to the GNR core team, I think last month. So we will continue to provide the council with updates in terms of progress on the strategic plan, but do want to ensure you that you have given direction to staff to work on those strategies in your adopted strategic plan.
And I think also, I don't see anyone from transportation here, so hopefully I'm not telling lies, but when they do the pavement, the asphalt rejuvenation, I think if I understand it correctly, that also like increases the permeability of it and reduces runoff from the roads. So that's built in there, and maybe in our transportation, as we move into our transportation bond, we can give feedback to transportation staff that like more permeable surfaces for sidewalks and sidewalk replacements could be something for them to explore, maybe.
It's one of the technologies I know they're using. They can't go widespread because of costs, but it's something I know that they are using and trying to figure out other ways to do it, which leads to the sidewalks as well when they're looking at the greenways.
Do you have any more questions?
I know we have another presentation.
I have lots of questions, honestly. Whenever we...
Do we want to hear the next part of the presentation and then get all the
Go back.
questions through?
It's going to be related. It's about native plants and what we're doing in landscaping. But if you want to keep going, Mary, up for a few. Let's keep going to the next presentation so we get there, and then we'll go back to Councilmember Black.
Hello again. Justin Rometta, Planning and Development. I wanted to, so you heard the very high level stuff from Bynum and others, and we did want to take an opportunity to get into a little bit of detail here with native plantings, and it's an area where we might be able to identify some gaps between what you heard Brooke talk about and the regulations that we have in place today. So did want to acknowledge my colleague Zach Manner, the city's urban forester, is in the audience. He can assist with any questions, and he helped develop this content. Zach is the leading authority in the city on the city tree manual and trees and plantings for street trees and trees on city-owned property. So we've got two technical documents that require vegetation and landscaping in the city. One is the tree manual. Again, applies to street trees in the rights of way and on city-owned or controlled property. And then we have the UDO, which applies to private property. And the UDO has a wide range of planting requirements, things like neighborhood transitions, which kind of soften the edge between mixed use or commercial development and adjacent residential development, other types of protective yards, landscaping in parking lots and other drive aisles, other vehicular surface areas. We have zoning frontages like the Parkway frontage that requires a 50-foot landscaped buffer. And then we have the overlay and special districts that you heard Bynum mention a little bit ago as well. So as far as the tree manual's concerned, it identifies a host of goals, and its really purpose includes environmental protection, obviously, air and water quality, stormwater runoff, et cetera. There are economic goals as far as trees and the urban canopy contributing to Raleigh's vitality. There are public safety considerations regarding how trees interact with infrastructure and visibility and those sorts of things. And then there's also a goal of improving social well-being and other health benefits with trees as well. So when the tree manual is identifying what types of species need to be planted for any given situation, there's a number of considerations, things like form or a tree's growth habit, how its degree of disease resistance. Trees that are planted as street trees need to be well suited for our urban conditions. They need to be able to grow in smaller, more compact soil, be able to handle stormwater runoff, et cetera. So there are considerations with choosing those types of species as well. The tree manual does explicitly prohibit exotic invasive species, so you cannot use those species to meet a street tree requirement, or and the city does not plant those on its property either. The tree manual also is aims to encourage diversity, right? Native trees are great, oak trees are great in Raleigh, but if every single tree in Raleigh were an oak tree, that might not be so good for a host of other reasons. And then there are also considerations for things like utilities and power lines, and so there are options for smaller maturing trees that we plant or require others to plant under power lines. Here's a list that Zach and his team maintain for possible street trees. You can see there's a kind of a broad range there. This is a mix of some of these species are native, some are non-native, but these are all trees for a variety of reasons that are well suited to be used as street trees, and we provide this on our website so that developers or others can consult this in developing their landscape plans. We also maintain a list of trees that you can't use. And again, some of these trees are native and some of them are non-native. But when considering street trees, like we talked about earlier, a certain type of native tree might not be well suited for use as a street tree. It may have a growth habit or that's unsuitable as far as visibility is concerned, or conflicting with infrastructure, or just carrying and bearing fruit that might not be suitable for an urban condition as well. But as you can see on the right, there is a list of invasive species that are explicitly prohibited. So the UDO carries a lot of those same goals and purpose as the tree manual, but it also takes into consideration some other things such as noise attenuation. So we use landscaping and zoning to help buffer noise as well. And we also use it to kind of screen uses that are adjacent to each other that might not be compatible, or could just benefit from some level of separation, such as an industrial use or warehouse next to a residential area might require a wider landscape area to help with those aesthetics. As far as what's required in terms of species in the UDO for any of those plantings, they have to be hardy to Zone 7, meaning they can grow in our climate, and they have to be locally adapted. And locally adapted just means that they're naturally found in North Carolina or adapted to our climate. It isn't a statement that they explicitly have to be native. So did want to point that out. And then as far as other characteristics, there are a host of minimum size requirements, other location requirements, how far apart you can plant trees from other trees, et cetera. And then generally there is a larger percentage or requirement for evergreen trees, given just obviously they provide better screening, and from a zoning standpoint, that's one of the main purposes of many of our landscaping requirements. So things to consider if you wanted to move forward with any changes or different requirements as far as native plantings go. Most of the changes would require a text amendment. And those changes either to the tree manual or to the UDO. We would want to consider, what is native? What does that term mean? It can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people, or how far back? What is the time period that a species has to have survived or grown in North Carolina for it to be considered native? It's hard to see on the presentation there, my apologies, but NC State has a good resource, their plant toolbox. I think you may have seen in some recent rezoning cases some conditions that reference that toolbox, so that might be a resource that we could use to help identifying what types of species are appropriate if you wanted to require or incentivize them. And then just think about the value that some non-native species have, things like ornamentals. A lot of people like their crepe myrtles and their Japanese maples, and they serve a good purpose. And so we would just want to be intentional and mindful about those sorts of things if we were crafting new regulations. And then the last two is just the availability of material. A requirement doesn't really provide any benefit if a landscaper can't get it from a nursery. So we'd want to make sure that whatever we were requiring is available. And then finally, just some kind of staffing considerations. Most of the staff in the planning department, myself included, are generalists. We know a little bit about a lot of things, but we are not foresters. We're not landscape architects. And so we might not have the level of expertise needed depending on how far or how detailed a requirement goes. So that's just something to keep in mind. So just to sum up briefly, there is no requirement in either of those two documents that native species be used in any given circumstance. The tree manual does prohibit invasives, but there is no explicit statement of that prohibition in the UDO. The UDO only requires that plantings be locally adapted, and again, that can be native and that can be non-native. But if you wanted to move forward with some recommendations, again, most any change would require a text amendment. We've identified what we think are some lower hanging fruit. If you wanted to consider those, we could consider including that prohibition in the UDO for invasive species. We could identify a certain percentage of native species that would have to be used for all new plantings, or provide incentives for them, or both of those things. I think you have a pretty broad range of options. You could, if you wanted us to come back with more detail to this committee, we could do that, or you could certainly, vote to move forward with any of these options or anything else you wanted to do today as well. So happy to answer any questions on that specific piece, or anything else if I can, or I can turn it over to someone who could.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back to Councilmember Black, who had a few questions, if you want to follow up on whatever topic.
I didn't have questions about this necessarily. I remember talking about this a lot during my short little tenure on the Environmental Advisory Board, specifically the use of native plants in development. So I'm just happy to see that the city is moving forward on it, but I'm going to defer to any of my other council members if they have questions specifically about native plant stuff.
I have some questions. Listen. Okay, so specifically street trees. Yeah, Zach, was hoping you'd come up.
Yeah, Zach.
You're also wonderful, Justin.
Timing. You couldn't tell Justin's reluctance, right? Good afternoon. Good afternoon, Zach Manor, Raleigh Parks, Recreation and Cultural Resources.
Awesome. So one, congratulations on securing $1 million so that we can plant more trees in Raleigh. That was really awesome. Good for you. Thank you
We're
for
very
that.
excited.
More trees, right? I did recently go to a conversation led by Project Pando, and sounds like they partner with the city a lot, but they have very small trees, and they were talking about some constraints they face around like putting those very small trees. I guess you know the technical jargon better than I would, but they said balled and burlapped. I guess the caliper of the tree matters. Can you speak a little bit more to why we can't use the tiny trees and we use the
Sure.
ones instead?
So most of the regulations in the UDO list trees as either understory trees or overstory trees. And so they break them into two sizes. So they have installation requirements around them. So an understory tree has to be at least 6 feet tall and have a caliper. So think about the diameter of the trunk at the base of 1.5 inches. So thinking like dogwoods, crepe myrtles, red buds, things along those lines. And then our shade trees need to be 3 inches in caliper and at least 10 feet tall. So think about your oak trees, your elm trees, things along those lines. In a lot of scenarios, a street tree is a fairly inhospitable environment for a tree. So while a seedling is a great use in some places, thinking about that tree's ability to survive daily interaction. So dogs, people's cars, air, water, a tree that's a foot tall tends to not do very well. So there are some pros to using smaller trees. It's costs less to grow. You can plant more of them. We use those a lot in reforestation projects. So thinking about some of the stream restoration that our partners in stormwater do, or kind of larger scale volunteer plantings, we can usually do a smaller tree. Typically in the right of way though, you need that 10-foot tree. So thinking about putting a 1-foot tree on Fayetteville Street, just using that as an example, typically they don't last very long. So that's usually why larger in those contexts are better, but there definitely is a place for using smaller trees.
That's super helpful. Thank you for that added context. Another question I have kind of folded into this, again, you are more expert than I am, but I have heard that like male trees are more commonly selected for landscaping because they don't like drop flowers and seeds, and but then they also have the knock-on effect of putting more pollen into the environment. Is that true? To the extent, is it true? Do we manage the gender distribution of our trees across the city?
Typically no. So trees, there are some trees that contain both and some trees that are individual. So it kind of depends on the particular species. There are only a couple trees that we specifically don't want females. Ginkgo biloba is the easiest one example there. The fruit has a very distinct odor for a significant period of time. So traditionally we don't have a preference. A lot of the trees that we use get grafted. So sometimes there is male and female rootstock. It just kind of depends. But a ginkgo specifically is one that we specifically try to avoid a female cultivar. But otherwise, it's just variable based on the tree.
I had a couple questions related to this topic. And maybe just to clarify, so right now, all we specify is tree species. We're not looking at other vegetation. So correct? Like we don't have any requirements over ferns or, other planting types.
I would defer to Justin on this, but I believe there are size requirements related to screening shrubs or other plantings.
Okay, but not species like recommendations or prohibitions.
No species or prohibitions, only evergreen versus deciduous considerations, and then, as Zach stated, height limits as well.
Okay, I just want to note that for our committee as we're thinking about whether we would want to move forward with any kind of native plant consideration here. Right now, all we regulate around is trees. Also, I was curious, is there anywhere that you would recommend to have street trees that are fruiting? So let's say a plum tree. I'm just thinking about opportunities even for foraging and eating, edible, trees in our landscape.
Sure. So why that list kind of says not great for street trees doesn't mean it isn't great for a yard or a park or a community garden. So just thinking about, we manage acorns in a lot of scenarios now. The other challenges around fruit oftentimes are about maintaining that. Sometimes it requires use of chemicals and extra pieces that are also a pretty contentious issue in the right-of-way in a lot of cases. So thinking about, there are definitely opportunities. It would depend on sort of the street. We do have some existing fruiting trees adjacent to the street kind of throughout the city. And there's a bit of a love-hate relationship from the neighbors, I would say, depending on how you feel about that particular tree and what it's leaving. So just to say, I would say there are possibilities. It's tough in a street tree scenario.
And I might have missed it in that list where the fruit trees were, said, I think, prohibited. Was that for all? That's not for private developments. That's only for street trees.
It's only for street trees,
Okay.
and that's one of the keys. Again, your backyard, it could be great, but we're trying to avoid thorns, things along those lines in the right of way itself.
And if we were to put some either, recommendations on additional vegetation species, so native species, let's say 25% native among beyond trees and other vegetative types, is that something that we have the capacity for? I realize that is a more complicated topic.
So I think you're talking about staff capacity. Yeah, no, I think that is what Justin was trying to speak to. I think we would have to reassess both the staffing in the planning department and then the operational departments that do the technical work around enforcement. So I do think that is a place where we would have to reevaluate both staffing levels and expertise to ensure that we both had sufficient staffing to take on those new regulatory requirements and that we had the appropriate technical expertise. I know we do have a member of our horticultural team here that does great work in terms of ensuring that the city is well represented in our own nursery work and our own vegetative, but that's not a regulatory function that we're staffed to more broadly across the city.
Yeah, I think my intent around natives is to think about them for pollination purposes, and so having some specific, kind of additional investments, especially in the private space around pollinator plants, generally native plants, that wouldn't necessarily have to be, the entire landscape, because I recognize there are values of other kinds of species that are not just native there. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about, but how that looks exactly, I'm not sure. I don't know if I'm prepared to make a motion about that at the moment. And maybe we would table this for another month, this particular topic. And if anyone has other comments, though, about natives, please.
Yeah, my only question was, and you actually kind of touched where I was going, is from a, enforcement standpoint and policy, and what does that look like? Mm-hmm. I think for me, that's something that we will have to figure out. What is it from a council? What's the standard we want to set? And then from there, I think then staff will tell us, okay, if this is the standard we want to set, this is what would be needed in order to meet it. So I think that's probably more of a conversation that we would need to have when we're talking about, setting policies of what types of trees we want to allow or not allow.
So we could leave this in committee, ask staff to bring us back a little bit more information on what that would look like, so that as we go into the budget cycle, we can ask for that if we ask for additional budgetary support if we want to make the policy choice. Does that sound?
Do these recommendations only cover trees at the moment, or would it expand to cover other types of?
That's, I think, up to us to say whether we would want to move in that direction, but increased staff capacity might be necessary.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree with, I think, what Councilmember Patton's saying in terms of next steps. So perhaps we can table this for the next GNR committee meeting, and I can work with you, Tansy, too, just to kind of develop more what are the options that we're looking for.
Yeah, happy to do that. I do know that we're zeroing in on time, that we're going to need to be vacating chambers or refocusing our efforts in chambers. Do want to make sure that we follow up on Councilmember Black's question as well. I believe in terms of following up additionally on some of the additional GSI opportunities in targeted areas as well, I believe was one of her outstanding questions from earlier in the meeting that I think we could also bring back in that same conversation.
Yeah, that'd be great. And Councilmember Black, did you have any other items that you just want to note?
Yeah, I feel like we're running out of time though. I didn't really, I had questions about like what the mitigation banking programs are, about what the green, I wrote this as green XYZ ordinance, which allows more people to live in mixed use. I wanted to know more about that. I don't know if we have time to talk about that. And then when I was reading through the green development document, one of the things that stood out to me was density bonuses in exchange for conservation of over 40% of the site. And I just wanted to know if the city has anything like that currently or any capacity for something like that. I know we do stuff for height and affordable housing, or like height, yeah, some stuff around height and density that's supposed to help with like affordable housing, but I just wondered if we had anything for conservation. But I don't know if we have time to get into all my questions, so maybe
we
just
can
the last one.
Yeah, we can certainly follow back up and go in greater detail about those conservation districts that were touched on briefly in the presentation, but we can provide
The question
greater
was
detail.
about the mitigation banking programs, the green ordinance, which allows people to live in mixed use, and then conservation density bonuses. But I think the only one I really want to know about at this point that would be relevant is conservation density bonuses, because I thought that was interesting when I was reading through it.
Were you hoping for an answer right now on that topic?
Maybe.
If anyone would like to.
I can really briefly just say that we do have what's called a conservation subdivision option in the code, and which is I believe what you may be referencing. It's an option where a developer can subdivide land, and in exchange for setting aside 40% of the land as open space, they get smaller lot sizes and a small density bonus as well. So we do have that in the code today. We also have what's called a compact subdivision. Compact subdivisions allow smaller lot sizes, but they don't get any density bonus, and they have a lesser open space requirement.
Oh, I think that would be interesting to kind of look at. I think it's really relevant for these like really large subdivisions, what are they called? Suburban developments. The word was escaping me. Like I know we just did a really big one with Hodge Roads. That was over like 500 acres of just like subdevelopment. So I was just thinking about how it would be interesting specifically for like infill. They talked a lot about infill development and specifically not expanding into rural areas. I think Raleigh, the whole triangle is in a really interesting space around that, because we have these like very urban cores that kind of come out of downtown that lead and kind of touch into the more rural parts of the city. And we do a lot of annexation and infill in that way. So I think I was just wondering where we were because I hadn't heard about it. But they do mention the conservation subdivisions, but also like density bonuses for maybe smaller projects might be interesting that are like for denser development in like urban areas that have tree considerations. So I don't know. I thought it was interesting. Yeah. Thank you, though.
You're welcome, and we can follow up with more detail on that
Okay.
if you'd like. Yep.
Sorry, I'll be so fast. I know we have to switch gears. As we're bringing stuff back, one brainstorm I've had that's of interest is I know the street trees are required when there's a tier 2 and 3 site plan, is that right? But not less complex at tier 1. And I would be interested in if there's a policy opportunity to mitigate some of our urban heat islands by having like if you're building at a tier 1 site plan, in an urban heat island, maybe there's some kind of street tree. So maybe we can bring back some exploration of the pros and cons and opportunities there.
Sure.
Great. Well, I want to thank everyone for coming to the GNR committee meeting today. I will note that we will see a proposal for updated principles for the Upper Neuse River Basin Association. These are revised Falls Lake Nutrient Management Strategy. So I serve as a representative to the city for UNRBA. And so just because it was mentioned in the presentation, I wanted to bring that up here, as I do expect that to come back to council soon. And I'll make sure that everyone gets a chance to check that out and provide input. And we can always bring it to GNR committee for more discussion if needed. Thank you. And with that, I am going to end the meeting.